using market research, using your past campaign performance, figure out what is the economic value that you bring to the customer. The first thing you need to do is figure out the value, and more importantly, does the customer perceive that value?
Coffee's for closers only.
So we've established my proposal is sound in principle. Now we're just haggling over price.
Let's see how much we're going for on eBay.
Man, it's the same as Dunkin' Donuts. Costs 15 times the price.
Today's podcast is sponsored by Jennings Executive Search. I had a great conversation with John Jennings about the skills needed in different pricing roles. He and I think a lot alike. If you're looking for a new pricing role, or if you're trying to hire just the right pricing person, I strongly suggest you reach out to Jennings Executive Search. They specialize in placing pricing people. Say that 3 times fast. Welcome to Impact Pricing, the podcast where we discuss pricing, value, and the sometimes relationship between them. I'm Mark Stiving. Today our guest is Alex Hoffman, and here are 3 things you want to know about Alex before we start. He has been in pricing as long as I have, and we're not telling how long that is. He's been involved in pricing at Telstra for more than 22 years. Oops, I guess that was a hint. And he's a huge jazz fan, and I can actually see his CD collection on the wall behind him right now. Welcome, Alex.
Thanks, Mark. Good to be with you. And good morning or good afternoon to the audience, wherever you may be.
Well, the good news is it's a podcast, so they can listen whenever they'd like.
Yeah, that's true.
So how did you get into pricing?
In a weird and circuitous way, actually. My background was in law and economics. I completed law and economics degrees at the University of Melbourne here in Australia. And I worked for quite a few years in mid-sized law firms. What really made me hate the experience was the way the pricing was structured, strangely enough, because everything worked to the tyranny of billable hours. And having to account for every hour, even when you weren't really delivering value to the customer, was a very oppressive and unhappy experience for me, let's put it that way. I then started to look around for jobs in corporates and landed a legal role within Telstra, Australia's incumbent telecommunications company, and still the biggest in terms of market share and certainly in terms of profitability. And then within a couple of years, I got offered a pricing role, leveraging my kind of economics background, and I started to work in pricing.
That's pretty fast. I think you are the first lawyer I've ever had on the podcast. So
by background only, I'll put a disclaimer there. By background only, I haven't practiced for more than 20 years.
Okay, good. So why do you stay in pricing? What is it about pricing that excites you?
It's, in a way, it's kind of a Cinderella in the corporates, but it's such a critical function because the impact of pricing on profitability, and I don't need to go into the academic studies. We know that there are plenty of studies that show that a 1%, a 1-point movement in price can result in 10, 11 points movement in margin. The impact and the idea of being at the intersection between marketing and pure finance, where you can shape strategy, that really gets me interested.
Yeah, that is pretty fascinating. And by the way, I don't know why we needed academic studies to show us that, because you could take any company and say, what's your profit margin?
Yeah.
And if you could increase price by 1% without impacting any of your costs, what's that do to that profit margin? It's
and the lower your profit margin, the bigger the impact.
Exactly right.
So that's an obvious one.
We don't need those academics who tell us that. So nice. So one of the things you had told me is that you were going to share some successes and some failures of attempts at implementing value-based pricing at Telstra. And I love anybody who's willing to talk about their failures. So let's go. But let's start with a success so you can look good.
All right. Okay. Let's talk about some of the successes. So during my time in Telstra pricing, one of the areas that I managed was mass market wireline. So this is really looking after all of the fixed broadband pricing for the mass market, which includes retail as well as small business customers. And this was done in almost a perfect storm environment where you had intensive
Real quick,
competition.
by
Yep.
retail, you mean to consumers, to houses?
Consumers, but small businesses as well. Small
Okay.
business was very much the behavioral dynamics, at least at the lower and the mid end of small business, is similar to consumer.
Yep. Okay.
And this is done in an environment where we have massive competition at the time, still do, and more importantly, something that is very Australia specific to the Australian market, the transition to NBN, or our National Broadband Network, which is a public sector initiative, and it basically means that the fibre providing all the wholesale to carriage service providers is run by a government monopoly. And Telstra, as the incumbent with its massive infrastructure, the copper in the ground, would have to sell this off to the monopoly provider. And essentially everybody becomes a reseller or a marketer, if you like. You no longer have that incumbent advantage because much of those upfront cost barriers to entry are gone. So in that environment, it was really important to understand the value that you bring to the customer. And in the past, pricing was very much a dark art. And you didn't require a lot of rigor when there wasn't a lot of competition. Now suddenly, because the margins were being eroded, it was important to understand where we could perhaps lift the price or change the plans. Now, most of the pricing has two features in telecommunications. It's subscription-based, so you're paying monthly charges, but it's also non-linear in the sense that there's a number of additional attributes that you get the customers to pay for, such as an activation fee, an installation fee, and in the past, where we would not have unlimited data plans, you'd charge for data, or a speed, you charge for a speed overlay to boost the speed of your plan. That was the way that it worked. And I guess one of the important things that we started doing during my time in the wireline space was the use of conjoint, and particularly adaptive conjoint, where we would commission market research companies, consultancies to run conjoints with our extensive customer base. Now, Mark, I don't know whether I should go into the details of conjoint analysis and what it does.
We've done that in the past. I actually have a course on conjoint available on our website, and I'm a huge fan of Epic conjoint. I know there's a bunch of them out there. I've used Epic, and they help me out with my courses, and so that's pretty cool. Hopefully, all of our listeners are aware, and if not, they can go listen to another podcast.
Right. I'm not going to go into the details then, but I'll talk about how we used it in pricing.
Yes.
I guess there's probably six features that were really critical to setting pricing that could maximize the capture of value from customers. One was understanding the relative importance of different product features. So how relevant is something like maybe having an entertainment inclusion, a Telstra TV, or subscription to an SVOD service? How relevant is that to a purchase decision, to a trade-off decision by the customer? Acquisition uplift. If we add an entertainment feature to a bundle plan, what's going to be the service acquisition? What's going to be the service uplift? Churn impact. Let's say we add more data to a plan. Is there going to be an impact on our base? Are we going to be able to reduce churn? Plan mix shift. If we start to adjust the pricing at the high end, how does that impact on the mix across all of the plans in our suite? Share of net adds. If we make a particular feature change or a price tweak, is our share of net adds relative to competition going to change? And are we going to take it from a sub-brand of Telstra's? And I must explain that Telstra does have a budget brand. And then the volume impact.
So I'm curious about this because as you're listing some of these things, I'm playing in my mind what the conjoint study looks like and how this is going to work out. And so the first question is, conjoint in my mind is usually done to say, am I going to purchase something? How do you use conjoint for churn?
So the features that were developed included trade-offs at a whole range of price points. Within the choice model, we are able to estimate. We're able to estimate the potential reduction, not only in the acquisition, but reduction in the impact on our own customer base. The models were sophisticated enough to do that. Now, of course, they're simulations. They're not real customer behavior. They're models, and there's a lot of assumptions in the models as well, particularly before you move to adaptive conjoint. Things like brand awareness, for instance. A lot of the conjoint models assume 100% brand awareness, but over time we shifted that as well, and we were able to model with different overlays of customer awareness. But the models were sophisticated enough to include impact both on potential on the whole customers, on the whole market in Australia, as well as on our own base.
Yeah, I guess I could see how you could look at customer preference on conjoint. And if you have that calibrated to past churn rates or past churn, you could say, yeah, this probably is what's going to happen if we do the following.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things I love about conjoint is the ability to do segmentation, because you've got a few hundred people who filled this out, and no two of them filled it out the exact same way. So what did you find in terms of different segments and who cared about what? How did you think about that?
Let me talk about the fixed broadband market, because that was my remit, and this is where there's a lot of the fascinating insights came out of. Essentially, what we found was that the broadband market in Australia was a bifurcated market. Speaking broadly of segments, there was a very large, let's say it was basically a 50-50 split. About half of the broadband users in Australia cared deeply about attributes such as network quality, network security, and brand. They needed to work with a reliable brand. The other half were fixated on price and cost. And so it became very obvious that Telstra could not play in the second half of the market, because to win over those customers, we would have to be 10-20% below certain competitor pricing. That meant effectively 30-40% reductions in our current price. We were trying to operate within 10-20% premium to our top two competitors. And then when you move to the other quadrant, you could find what segmentation allowed us to do was then to find pools of opportunity with competitor customers who were also focused not on price, but on quality of service. But our message was just not getting through. It may have been, though, in those particular geographies, there was lack of P&A spend. It may have been that the Telstra messaging was focused around other attributes apart from the attributes that the customers indicated were important to them. So it helped us to hone the marketing. That segmentation helped us to hone the marketing message and understand in which geographies we needed to play to win over those extra customers.
Okay, so let me see if I could say this and it isn't just so darned obvious it isn't funny. We do conjoint. We find a market segment that really cares about one or two really key features. We find people in a geography that really care about those one or two features, and we change our marketing messages to talk about those one or two features. Now, doesn't that just make sense?
It's a completely obvious thing, but it's amazing how much, and this is what I found in Telstra, it's amazing how much the marketing is not really set to a deep understanding of focus on customer needs.
Yeah,
it's not a bottom up. It's not a bottom up process. And as you get involved in pricing, you really understand the critical nature of the message. So we're about capturing the value that's created through product innovation and the like. But if the messaging doesn't cohere with that, if the marketing doesn't cohere with that, you get nowhere. Yeah. I've ended up in situations where we designed the most elegant of bundles that were based on what the conjoint was showing was important to the customer groups that we were targeting. And yet when you got to the marketing, the marketing guys would often focus on completely different features. And so it never kind of percolated. So you needed to ensure that you got strong input and buy-in into the marketing, as well as the pricing strategy, the financial analysis, and that sort of thing. Marketing is a critical part of the role.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. When I often talk about pricing, or I got into pricing, you start to realize, look, pricing is really about understanding how buyers value our products. And then once you and I start learning how to do that, we realize, well, why doesn't marketing know that? Or why doesn't product management, who's designing the next product, know that? Right? And so this concept of value becomes so important, and yet it feels like it's a mystery in our companies, in the companies we deal with.
It's much easier to focus on cost, which is ultimately what the when you look at Telstra strategy, and a lot of it today is around building the right network and developing particular product innovations, especially in the area of e-health and e-commerce, and leveraging the remote networking trend that COVID has accelerated. But much of the other parts of the strategy is about cost, and it's about cost cutting. It's not about how do we go about optimizing the revenue part. It's hard. That part is hard.
It seems to me companies have to focus on costs. I'm not going to take that away from them, but there is no doubt they spend more time on cost than they do on value. And I think those two are the opposite sides. Now, I had the pleasure, one of my clients in the past was actually an ISP, an ex-Telco ISP. And I found it fascinating because they've been in business for 50 years, 60 years, some huge number. And it never struck me that these guys are really running a subscription business. Duh, right? Isn't that obvious?
Every telco is a subscription business.
Right. And then I had the chance to teach them about subscriptions, the way we think about subscriptions and software. And there was aha after aha for these people as we're thinking about how to run subscriptions. So I just found that completely fascinating, that people that I thought were going to know, 100 times more than me about subscriptions were truly learning, and it was fascinating. I loved that.
Yeah, it's an interesting experience, because when I was in Telstra, I was involved in building pricing for a new subscription business that we were launching, and it was very similar to an insurance product. I'm talking about Telstra's Platinum service, and Platinum service is essentially an IT support service. So what we found, again through the market research that we did, was by dint of the demographic and the fact that Telstra has a predominant market share amongst the older population, the older demographic in Australia, we had a lot of customers who were just not comfortable about setting up home computers and ensuring that the internet worked. They needed services apart from the mum and dad operations that were being run in the street. Something that was based on the Telstra brand, which is still a very trusted brand in Australia. And so that gave the opportunity to set up a service where Telstra where Telstra techies would go out and support these customers. Now, there were once-off charges, of course, but you could build monthly subscriptions at varying levels with various value inclusions to assist individuals. And they would essentially start paying for peace of mind. So that was an interesting business. And that involved looking at the subscription model from the ground up.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. One of the things we often see in companies, and tell me if you saw this at Telstra, even with the way it was, but we often see this in companies, is the CFO says, I can't lose money on a customer. And so I have to make sure every customer is profitable. Now, in a lot of ways, that's an honorable position. But when you do anything like insurance, you say, I get it. I'm going to lose money on some customers, but I'm going to make a lot of money on all of my customers. And so did Telstra, as a subscription business, have trouble adopting that thought process?
I honestly didn't see it. If anything, so it's. I think it was understood from the start that there will be a lot of cross-subsidization going on. And that, in many ways, is the story of Telstra. In the past, and probably even today with the transition to NBN, but in the past, there were areas which were negative in the absolute sense. They were negative margin generating areas of the business, but it was understood that for various reasons we had to maintain them, and there was cross-subsidization going on. The principle was you look at the overall profitability within that business unit or within that product area, and you focus on that. But I would say that Telstra provides a lot of leeway, particularly with new businesses that it enters, like e-health. It doesn't expect to make an immediate incremental margin on business ventures.
That's a healthy attitude.
In a way, but when I come to the failures, I think you'll see the other side of the coin as well. I don't think I'll speak of anything that is not obvious.
Well, let's hear one. Yeah. Well, before you do that, I did want to point out one more thing. We did the same thing when I was working with my ISP in terms of figuring out what the segments are and who does what. And the thing I found so fascinating is one of the segments they pointed out for the type of deliverables they needed were households that had gamers in them. And it's like the deliverable, the technology we have to give those guys is very different than a household that has 5 streams of video running at once. And so it was pretty fascinating.
And that's one of the areas where there can be genuine pricing innovation, particularly with 5G coming on board now. Cloud-based gaming is dynamically growing, and customers who are game addicts, by the very definition, do not necessarily behave in a rational way at particular points in time when they need their surge in speed. They're prepared to pay what I would call almost surge-like pricing. And so you can develop all sorts of interesting concepts there that could help boost the margin.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So it's all about understanding who cares about what and when.
Exactly. And when.
And when, yeah. So, okay, so now you got to share. Let's hear a failure.
I'll speak about failures, and I guess it's cultural failure. It's more of a cultural or psychological failure. The backdrop is there's a real disparity. What I found stepping out of the role now and looking back on my time in Telstra, I found that in time there was a real disparity between the sophistication of the pricing tools, the insights that the pricing teams had developed, and those who were making the critical decision, so the C-suite. There tended to be a disconnect. And when you had strong pricing managers, and at one stage we had centralized pricing function with an executive director reporting directly to the CFO and the CEO and the board. And he shared a lot of inconvenient truths. In the end, that tended to get shut down in favor of groupthink. At least that was my impression, Mark. So you have this disparity between people who provide the insights and the people who make the critical decisions. And perhaps the failure on my part, and those like me, have been failure of communications. We may not have been effective in communicating, in articulating those insights. But it's also, I think, a case of misalignment of incentives. As surprising as it may be, product management, at least in Telstra, was not really incented on the basis of margins. It was more around revenue. At first it was sales volumes, then it moved to revenue. But margins were not really a critical factor. And so when we in pricing focus on overall profitability, incremental profitability coming from initiatives, that was politely listened to, but often the attitude was, we need to grow quickly, we have sales targets. And you kept on, whatever the strategy may have been, the reality on the ground was a constant oscillation between we've got to hit our margins for the quarter and we've got to hit our volumes for the quarter. And depending on where you were across the spectrum, you would oscillate wildly between the two without having a consistent approach.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating way to think about it. In my mind, it's obvious I would give up 10% of revenue for 20% more profitability every single day.
Yeah.
But but in a lot of cases, companies can't do that. They're compensated on revenue, or
Exactly.
maybe the CFO thinks our stock price is based on
let's
revenue.
be transparent. It's not companies, it's executives. Executives get compensated on the basis of certain metrics that may not align with profitability objectives for the company. It's the law of agency kicking in.
Yeah, and I don't know that there's a way around that. Did Telstra, even when you had a centralized pricing organization, did you have a pricing community or pricing committee or pricing council where you had executives from a bunch of different departments meeting and talking about these are the pricing issues we're dealing with, and here's how these initiatives we're going to go drive to make changes?
Only on an informal basis. There was never a cross-business unit committee to deal with this. Usually the way that it works is if I'm looking after fixed broadband or wireline pricing, I would work closely with my product management colleagues, and where we could not come to an alignment, we would escalate to our respective management, and potentially that gets escalated above. There have been cases where certain decisions have been escalated to the CEO level. And what I found fascinating was that every time, not almost, but every time, the presumption, the burden of proof would be displaced. The burden of proof would not be on the guys advocating bold pricing changes. And by bold, of course, I mean discounting the hell out of the product. The burden of proof was on the guys who were trying to protect margins. And when challenged, I was in a room where a particular senior manager was challenged to show, well, you're advocating this. Can you show that you could get the volume necessary to offset? Do you have past campaign experience to show that the volume would necessarily be large enough to offset the destruction of margin on kind of the current organic run rate of customers? And the response was, I don't need to prove anything. You are the guys who need to prove it. And we're talking about a company that delivers $25, $26 billion in revenue annually.
Yeah, it's certainly challenging if companies aren't going to focus on margin and profitability. So I'm not sure I could be a pricing person in a company like that.
It makes for interesting challenges, but Mark, when you do have when you have a good support network, it can work. And we had a great support network from the executive director down. At some point, the support network disappeared.
Yeah. I guess the other side, so you and I have been talking about margin or profitability and how I'd take 20 points of margin for 10 points of revenue any day of the week, right? Doesn't matter to me. But I guess if the CEO said to me, I don't want to give up my 10 points of revenue, or in fact, I want 10 more points of revenue. Go figure out how to get 10 more points of revenue.
I want to grow my market share from 50 to 55%.
Right. So okay, great. I've got a set of goals. I can use price as one of my levers to go help achieve those goals. Even if it isn't the goal that I would have chosen, I'm not the CEO, so it's okay. Yeah. I could live with that. Just give me a goal.
But you must be transparent and show that for the 5-point increase in market share, if we focus on price and if price delivers that, and I can model that using conjoint or using past campaign experience, I can show you that 5 points will mean that we drop $250 million in margin. Here is the analysis. Here are the assumptions. Here are the key inputs. Do you support it? So long as you're transparent, you need to be completely transparent about what it will cost. But it doesn't make for a lot of confidence, and it doesn't build morale, of course, in the team when that happens. And I guess when I look back now, the mass market pricing team in Telstra in 2018 was of a certain size. That is down by about 2/3. Much of it has been redundancies, of course, because Telstra is going through this program as part of the Telstra 22 strategy of redundancies where 1/3 of the workforce is gone. But ultimately, those decisions about growing and supporting sales volume and market share, ultimately that translates to those redundancies. Because then you start to push frantically on the cost lever. I'm not saying all of it is due to suboptimal pricing decisions, certainly not. A lot of it has been due to the very fact of the transition to NBN, which has destroyed margins across the entire telco industry. But it's not as if Telstra and other incumbents weren't getting compensated for that. The Commonwealth government through NBN was paying for the decommissioning of much of the infrastructure through particular ongoing payments. The question was, where do you invest those billions of dollars that you would get to give you the ROI of the revenue stream that was being replaced?
Yep. Yeah, you've got to figure out where you're going to grow and what you're going to do.
And the answer was nowhere.
Yeah. Alex, we are running out of time. Unfortunately, this has been fascinating. I've loved this conversation.
So have I.
But what's one last question? What's one piece of pricing advice you'd give our listeners that you think could have a big impact on their business?
Maybe it's an obvious one, but really figure out, using market research, using your past campaign performance, figure out what is the economic value that you bring to the customer. The first thing you need to do is figure out the value, and more importantly, does the customer perceive that value? Are you aligned in your view of the value? And if the customer doesn't perceive it, why not? Is it a fault in your marketing?
Yeah, I'd say if the customer doesn't perceive it, it isn't really value. So I'm with you.
Well, yeah. I do make that distinction between perceived and economic value, but yeah, I agree.
Exactly. I guess there's a thing such as perceived economic value. There we go. Nice. Wow. Alex, thank you so much for your time today. PEVA. Yeah, there we go. Hey, if anybody wants to contact you, how can they do that?
Through my LinkedIn.
Okay, we'll have the LinkedIn link on the show notes. That'd be great. And episode 131 is all finished. Thank you very much for listening. If you enjoyed this, would you please leave us a rating and a review? Apple Podcasts, any place you listen, they're very valuable to us. And I promise I'll read it on the air if you leave it. And I might even send you a copy of my newest book, Win, Keep, Grow, how to something, right? How to accelerate your, just look it up on Amazon. I don't remember the rest of the title. That's sad, isn't it? And thank you. Finally, if you have any questions or comments about the podcast or about pricing in general, feel free to email me, mark@impactpricing.com. Now, go make an impact. Thanks again to Jennings Executive Search for sponsoring our podcast. If you're looking to hire someone in pricing, I suggest you contact someone who knows pricing people. Contact Jennings Executive Search.